propose amendments to the mayor's 2017 general government operating budget and others. Mr. Mayor, I understand that you would like to say a few words first, but before we do, let's do introductions, and we'll start with you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Ethan Berkowitz, Mayor.
Lance Wilbur, OMB.
I'm just a guest, I'll manage budget advisor.
Thank you.
Patrick Boyd. John Weddleton.
Mr. Bosky, are you on the phone?
Yes, I'm here.
Thank you, Mr. Bosky.
I'm Steve.
Elby Free Johnson.
Good training. Pete Peters, Bill Starr.
Forrest Dunbar.
Courtney Peterson.
Mike Davidson.
Chris Judy, Office of Economic and Development.
Dave Swarner, Anchorage Fire Department. Dennis LeBlanc, Anchorage Fire.
Thank you. Mr. Mayor, you have the floor.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair, members of the Assembly. We brought forward, we're here to hear what your proposed amendments are to the budget. I just want to emphasize that this is a process that we have to go through together. I think we're all trying to get to a good answer for the municipality, mindful of the parameters of a tight budget and the state's ongoing fiscal problem. And that being said, I hope that if people have proposed suggestions, we can also look at them. And if anyone has amendments that are not part of the packet today, the sooner we can get them, the sooner we'll be able to give them due consideration.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Olson, would you like to say anything?
Mr. Jackson, thank you. Since we've submitted the budget, and since the work sessions have come out, the administration has been looking at some other additions that have come in, and as we're putting together the changes that we'd like to see, what Rose has passed out is a summary of the proposed amendments that the administration is going to be looking to do as part of an SBRS. And if I could, and we sort of did it in a highlight section, and if I could just kind of spend a couple minutes going through these.
We have 2 hours, so please.
All right. So what you have on this sheet are sort of 3 different sections. One is proposed amendments to the General Government 101 fund, and then some adjustments to the 191, which is a fund in which interest is earned from our investments, and then we're going to make some adjustments to Girdwood that we're working on. But if I could just go through items 1 through 12 initially. Since we've sent in our proposed budget, we recognize that the vote by mail process is a little bit behind, and so as part of 2017, we recognize that we're going to need some election workers, and that we also recognize that we have space requirements for the vote by mail process. So the administration is looking to propose adding some additional funds to cover those things. And since then, we've been working with the Assembly office on some other adjustments as they relate to labor and professional services. We've also received some adjustments proposed from the Equal Rights Commission and Internal Audit. So they're reflected on this sheet as well. In the CFO's office, Robert Harris and his team, they do a lot, they spend a lot of time on managing those activities in public finance, our lending, our debt, a variety of things. So there's an opportunity to charge some of his time, maybe 20% of his time and his staff to that 191 fund because they are supporting those investments. In addition to fire, when we reviewed the labor budget for fire, we recognized that we put a little too much money in their labor, so we reduced that labor budget down. That would then basically reduce the reduction in the service adjustments that we had proposed. So as we recognize, we had some reductions there, so we would be able to ease some of those service reductions by that labor adjustment. For fire, we also found out from AWWU in an email after the budget was submitted, the increase that we had for 246 is not going to be required, so we would be taking that reduction out. The other 2 items, or the next item, item 10, reprographics. As you recall, I mentioned this in presentations. There was an original proposal to reduce staff and non-labor inside the IT department's reprographics. We did not accept the labor portion, but we did the non-labor portion, and we need the licensing and the maintenance of the software and the print shop. So we're proposing to add that back in. Another item is the GIS Center of Excellence. For those of you who might be familiar with the Center of Excellence, about 4 years ago, the GIS, and for some time before that, GIS was housed inside of IT and in general government and for supporting enterprise. Well, for a brief time, it was moved to AWWU. This is a proposal to bring it back into general government where it belongs. There's a couple reasons. The RCA is keeping an eye on this, and then having general government services being operated out of a utility, it makes more sense to have that inside general government, so we're moving that service back into general government under IT. And with those additions and subtractions, we still have, in order to get to a zero, there's some opportunity based on current prices and our current projections that we might be able to save another 10% on our fuel savings, so that's where that would end up. So on the 101 fund, the administration is looking at sort of a net, no change in the budget with these proposed adjustments with these adds and additions. So under 191, I mentioned that is a fund in which interest earned on our investments, the public finance takes about 2% of that off for their operating costs. They reinvest the other 98% back into the fund. And so we're looking to make some labor adjustments where we can charge appropriately to 191 for some labor and professional services and supplies. And then one of the items that we have a need for is support for professional services on the CAFR. There's an opportunity we might be able to support that with 191 rather than general government. And then the last item, I think Mr. Weddleton might be apprised of this. He and Mr. Abbott were down at the Girdwood Board of Supervisors in October after the budget was submitted. And we wanted to know if they wanted to make some adjustments either in first quarter as part of this budget. They wanted to do as part of this budget. We're still working on those numbers. So from the administration's perspective, on Monday, we're working on an S version, and depending on what the conversation is as a result of today, these are the things the administration is looking at as part of our S version to be submitted to you on Monday. So thank you, Madam Chair. And if you have any, I'd like to have two more items, Madam Chair. Rose and the Assembly, you should have received a resolution from the Planning and Zoning Commission in support of the capital improvement budget as submitted. Most of their comments were from Planning and Zoning were an opportunity for us to work earlier and closer with them, but to also recognize the process that we went through this year was better than we did last year. So there's always room for improvement. And then I am in receipt of additional comments from ZIG, questions from ZIG. I think that were funneled to me. We're working through those, but for those of you who may have seen his questions, we have identified positions that are recognized for SAP that are out of the budget to go live. I think his comments were that's a pretty hard deadline to be made, and then all of the professional services that were identified have been removed. Part of that, we want to rectify that and make that correction to put half of those professional services back in. So I appreciate his comments. I think many of those were of like mind of what we're thinking. It's just how we get to the solution is going to be a little different.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbur. Mr. Starr, before I go to you.
Who did you just reference in that last comment? Was it Mr. Flemings?
Mr. Zig.
Oh,
Zig. Yeah, he sent some comments in about what we're doing with SAP positions, and I just responded to this.
As it relates to the amendments proposed by Assembly members, because some of them, or a fair number of them, haven't been implemented in the US version, does that mean you don't agree with them, or what's going to happen?
Excellent question, Mr. Starr. I did not receive these until later yesterday, so I didn't have any opportunity to work with the administration on whether or not these could be blended into this. This is, so, as a package, so I didn't have them all at one time, so I haven't had a chance to work with the mayor and his staff to know if any or some
Yeah,
of these
because
could
in
be
years
blended.
past, we've seen sort of a concurrence that built into an S version.
And that may be part of what we submit on Monday.
Another S version? Or you don't have the S version?
We don't have, these are the topics that we're thinking about including into an S version.
Okay, that's all.
Thank you, Mr. Starr. And I have some comments to make. And I don't want to put words in the administration's mouth, but what I think has got to happen is if we're done with this work session today, the administration is going to determine which one of our amendments, well, which of our proposed amendments you'd like to include before you fit in the S version that we're going to receive next week. Is that correct? Thank you. Okay, and I have a question before we get started. Can you tell us what right now is in unrestricted fund balance? Just roughly.
Balance. 4.5.
Okay, that's good enough. That's good enough. And so the process that we're gonna have this morning is when we get to each amendment, I'm going to, look to the person that submitted it, and then to deliver, their comments, and then if there are any other comments on the floor, Mr. Dunbar.
I'm sorry, Madam Chair, is this the appropriate time to ask specific questions about these proposals, or is that sort of the next step?
I would like to go through our proposed amendments, and then when we're done, then we can talk about the administration's proposed amendments, if that's okay with everyone. Okay, great, thank you. All right, any other questions before we move forward? All right, great, amendment number 1, who would like to deliver Mr. Croft's, proposed amendment since he hasn't arrived yet? Anybody? Okay, I'll do it myself. Mr. Croft is proposing an amendment in the Assembly Department in the amount of $48,000. The description is professional services funding to continue the contract with Eco Consultant to provide independent third-party review of the SAP project. This amendment will provide funding through June 30th, 2017 for SAP, anticipated to go live July 1st, 2017. The amount again is $48,000, and the funding source is from fund balance. Okay, amendment number 2, Mr. Dunbar.
So I'm sorry, to go back to the other one, just ask sort of a process question. Are we going to be, so we're not debating this today,
No.
but what sort of the process you want to go through discussing? Because, for example, that amendment that we just had, I would have liked to ask him a question, but he's not here. But I guess I'd like to ask you, because the consultant sort of works for you, Madam Chair. And I know that you have contemplated not extending his contract. And I wanted to, ask 2 questions. One is, why do you think that we shouldn't perhaps extend his contract? And then to the administration, were this consultant not in place, would you still be able to provide us with a similar quality of briefing on the progress of the SAP project?
Okay, I'll respond first. And I had some concerns, okay, when we were about to renew the contract before, because I just thought at that point that it wasn't really necessary. And with input from other members of the body, I was convinced, and the majority felt that we should extend this contract through December.
Right.
Okay. Now, in terms of extending it in January, I really haven't had an opportunity to give it some thought, and I think it's the decision just not for me to make, but for the body to make. The administration, do you want to make some comments?
Is there anyone
You
who
don't
can
have to,
speak
but,
to
yeah.
SAP? So we get regular briefings where, like Zig, but also.
We just had that at 11 o'clock.
Right, exactly. I'm sorry, I missed that one. Could you, if we did not extend this contract, could Arlen, what's that? Alden, sorry. Could Alden continue to give us a similar quality of briefing?
If I could jump in, I think that we can get back to you, but I would want to talk to Alden. I mean, he's going to continue to give you monthly updates at your budget and finance committee meetings on those, and if those are not adequate enough or not complete enough, obviously we can go from that feedback. But I can get back to Alden to see, because honestly, I'd have to find out what type of briefing and information you get from Zig. Reply, get back to you.
Yeah, if I could follow. Go ahead, Mr. Flynn, go ahead.
Well, I haven't disclosed support of certain aspects of this contract, but City provides an outsider's perspective, Alden provides an insider's perspective. It's what value you place in the outsider's perspective. That's the simplest way to distill it.
Another way to look at it is, do we think that these briefings are changing our decision-making in any way? Anyway.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Okay, amendment number 2, Mr. Dunbar.
So, Mr. Croft also is on this one. Let's see, where are we at? So I originally had looked into the ERC after they had, looking at discrepancy I felt between their actual expenses and their sort of projected expenses, and I came up with a significantly larger number than this. But then working with Mr. Croft and with Rose, we settled on something that I think is a little more, makes a little bit more sense. I don't know, Rose, do you want to talk about how we got this exact number a little bit?
I can provide the information provided previously.
Okay.
Helpful.
So, now this is like, in a lot of detail here, I don't want to read the whole thing. Suffice to say, I feel that there was sort of a mistake made. I have nothing against the ERC as an institution. I just felt that there was sort of a mistake made in the budgeting between their actuals and their projected expenses. And actually, when they were presenting, they said we gave $100,000 back last year because we ended up not having the expenses we thought. So that drove the desire for this amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar, and if I can make one comment, keep in mind too, that the Equal Rights Commission, their budget is being reduced by $60,000 in the administration ESPERS after discussion.
Right.
Like that. Okay, any other comments before we move on? Okay, great, amendment number 3, Mr. Flynn.
Madam Chair, would you indulge me for a moment for a brief philosophical discussion?
Just kidding.
So, not to overly paraphrase my friend Mr. Starr, a little bit argumentative, a little bit lecture-oriented. The amendments you see from me are twofold in their purpose, in that one, the administration presented to us a tax cap budget, and so I sought offsets for my proposed changes. The aggregate total of the supplied budget reduction, if all of my amendments were approved as written, would be about 5.9%. That's the argument part. The lecture part is we as a body approve departmental budgets for those who are newer to this process and rely on our department managers to manage within those confines. So a 5.9% reduction to supply budgets across the board, should these all be approved, doesn't mean all supplies drop by 5.9%. It means they manage within the line item that we give them for their department. So with that, this one is specific to the senior centers, Anchorage and Chudiak. The mayor's budget proposed, I believe, a 5% reduction. I would restore that. This is something I actually sought and obtained an increase for after about 6 or 7 years of flat budgeting, and I'm not inclined to take a step backward this time.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. I don't see any comments. Let's move on to amendment number 4, Mr. Trainer.
Number 4 has to do with restoring funding to the senior centers. They've been held static for years, they need to have their money. As the amount of seniors in Anchorage increases, we need to meet the demand. So,
Parallels Mr. Flynn's?
yes.
If I may,
It parallels, but it goes from fund balance, if I may, Madam Chair.
We're taking fund balance.
Yeah, and this gets into the philosophical part. My preference would be to preserve as much fund balance as possible through this budgetary process. And then once the dust settles, look at an appropriation fund balance to our municipal trust to provide long-term tax relief. We can differ. It's okay. There's different ways to do this, but that's my preference. And that's why I took a different approach to the training.
thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Trainer?
The $4.5 million mine is to take out of fund balance. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Trainer. Mr. Stark, do you want to comment?
Nope, not yet.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any other comments on amendment number 4. We're at amendment number 5, Mr. Evans. Mr. Evans is not here. Who would like to deliver his proposed amendment?
I'd be delighted to read it for you, Madam Chair.
Thank you.
Just
Mr.
take note
Edgar.
that 5 and 6 are the same, too, but
I would be happy to do that. So amendments 5 and 6.
Well, we're on number 5 right
Well,
now.
actually, then we should probably skip ahead, Mr. Dunbar, with 10% since they're semi.
That's kind of gonna be a decision I'm gonna make, but we're at number 5, and if you wanna present it, that would be really great.
It reads that the restore fund for the Alaska Domestic Violence Sexual Assault Intervention Program adds staff operating fund grants to providers in the amount of $36,000 proposed taken from some fund balance.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. And Mr. Dunbar, your amendment number 6 is exactly the same thing, so my recommendation would be that we combine this into one proposed amendment. That's okay with you?
I agree, and just out of curiosity, would the amendment then read introduced by Evans and Dunbar?
Yes. Thank you. We're now at amendment number 7, Mr. Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very similar to what my previous amendment, this is a library amendment for $208,559. It does so by offsetting approximately 1.6% reduction in supply budgets and restores positions that otherwise would be deleted. It does not restore the Friends of the Library piece. That I think can be managed more easily given the size of the library budget without an actual increment.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. I don't see any comments. We're now at amendment number 8. That's a proposed amendment offered by me. And it's for the library, $150,000. And the reason why I picked this number is because it's the number that the Library Advisory Board asked for. And the source of funding will be in fund balance. I don't see any comments. We're at amendment number 9, Mr. Training.
Amendment number 9 is mine. It deals with snow removal administration. They're suggesting they want to go to 84 hours after snowfall before we scrape off the ground. 84 hours doesn't work in a Arctic city. We need to be there within 70 hours. So this just restores snow removal in our area to 70 hours, comes out of fund balance.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. I don't see any questions. Okay, we're at amendment number 10. Mr. Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This would restore the budget for the mayor's community grants funding. And we were talking before the meeting started, for example, about my attendance this morning at the campfire breakfast where they're raising money for before and after school programs for kids. This is one of the sources of that funding. You've also heard from a number of members of the arts community about the importance of these grants, not just because of the funds that they provide, but because they provide a legitimacy to the organization when they pursue additional grants from private sector sources. So this specific line item is really a force multiplier in terms of our nonprofits making our community a better place. And not to get excessively hyperbolic, but the arts programs that benefit from this pay for our Performing Arts Center. They're the ones who pay the rent. If they don't have funds to operate, and they don't have funds to attract private sector funds, they're not using the PAC. And therefore, we are on the hook, despite the fact that we have contracted out the operation of the facility to a nonprofit. And again, not to be excessively hyperbolic, but that center plays a very important role in maintaining the vitality of our downtown. And it brings people to downtown Anchorage, patronize businesses, restaurants, hotels, etc. in the off-season. This is something I explained to Mr. Abbott and Mr. Wilbur when this proposed cut was initially proposed. This is something I went to the mat for with the previous administration. They ultimately acquiesced and agreed that this was a good use of public dollars, and I think this is critically important. Again, I've offset it with the reduction of supply budget again around 1.6%. I really don't care what the fund source is, but I think it's a critical component of our budget.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Trainee and then Mr. Starr.
Mr. Flynn, have you figured out what the total cuts you're making to police and fire? What it is? I haven't gone through them all yet. What's the total reduction in police and fire?
Total cut is about 5.9% of supply budgets throughout general government.
So how much,
But that's very-
$100,000 or what?
For police and fire, it would be.
I believe that our budget analyst has a spreadsheet with those numbers.
I did ask her to prepare that, so.
Rose,
So did
Police for all four of Mr. Flynn's proposed amendments is $177,246. For fire, it's $151,016.
Thank you, Ms. Foley. Mr. Flynn, anything else? Thank you. Mr. Starr. I'm sorry, Mr. Trainee, you have the floor.
Just from my perspective, Patrick, I know what you're trying to do, but I've been in meeting after meeting where the number one concern among our constituents is police and fire protection. Quite frankly, I'm going to do anything that cuts that. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Mr. Trainee. Mr. Starr.
On two issues, and I do appreciate Mr. Flynn's historical about trying to reach a middle ground on the grants. One of the assurances that we had was sort of the fair play in the grants, administration of them. So, Mr. Mayor, how do you have your system set up in terms of people that reach out to the municipality for an outright grant? Two questions, are they already predetermined for next year? And if not, how do you do it?
They're not predetermined for next year. And this is one of the ongoing challenges is usually you have a similar group of people apply from year to year. And as we try and expand the pool to make more people aware of the grants, that's a communications challenge that we're working on.
Well, the arts seem to be pretty focused on a specific number, and I was kind of perplexed on their expectation that they were just gonna get a certain amount of money.
And that came about because we issue a certain amount of grants. The total grants that we proposed in our budget was reduced by a percentage, and we apportioned that out to the arts as well.
So your application process, I appreciated the previous administration's compromise, and I don't want to quote exactly what happened, but some of it was a vetting of not only what we were going to give them, but what they were going to give us to the community in that conversation. Are you having that with these grant applications?
We are, and we're also having a conversation about structurally changing how arts funding works here by developing an arts council that could pursue funding sources that the municipality is not qualified for as a grant recipient. And so we're exploring ways of expanding the pool of arts money that comes into Anchorage.
Well, thanks for two messages. One is that you haven't predetermined exactly yet, so that others, maybe new people wanting to reach out for grants, don't feel like, the windows, the doors shut.
It's not, but I would caution that the grants that we hand out go for things like homelessness, other sort of force multipliers for other concerns that the municipality has.
Well, they're in your budget, certainly. I mean, that's why we have the negotiations about who gets to disperse them. There's also been an opportunity from time to time for in-kind, I guess you'd call them outright donations or in-kind grants where Iditarod or Fur-Ronde doesn't have to pay for barricades or doesn't have to pay for certain snow clearings. And do we have flexibility inside the departments for those communications, or would you be the central point of contact on those communications? Specifically, I can hear from Iditarod, I can hear from Iron Dog, wanting to know how the city's gonna kind of offset.
I would put it this way, I think there's some measure of flexibility. There's a danger in treating different applicants differently. And I want to make sure that whatever we do in an even-handed way without showing any favoritism.
Well, that's why I asked the question, but by the same token, the city shouldn't be in the business to make a profit on the backs of those. The force multiplier, you talk about the Iditarod lead over and all the things that happen. So, I mean, if the city's got to do traffic control anyhow, is that really a billable item to Iditarod, or is it just the city with expensive money anyhow? I don't know. I mean, when the president came, $425,000 was just our cost, unfortunately. We can prepare for the Iditarod, and I'm a proponent of outside events in the winter because we're trying to be a winter city. So I like those answers, except the point where we differ on what the city should do anyhow to encourage that. So fair play, I appreciate that answer, but the outreach would be, would hopefully be a clearer message. What we have flexibility in kind.
There is flexibility, and we do provide in-kind.
Perfect. Yeah, I know.
Just not in every instance.
So back to answer the question, as they reach to us, is it through the mayor's office for direction on the in-kind requests?
In a sense, we're going to be deluged with requests.
No, not really, but Bear Paw always asks
Yes.
me who was the player this year, who's.
Well, Bear Paw's a recipient of some of our grants too, so, yeah, people should come through our office, and if it's inappropriate to come through my office, then we can send them in the right direction.
Okay, well, that's clarity, because it's, usually John Rada plays in the park, we have our own Parks and Rec budget, and it gets messy if you're not centralizing.
I mean, we're not centralizing because it depends on the need. Some will go through the police department, some through the fire, it just all depends.
I get that. Thank you, that's all.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, thank you, Mr. Starr. Mr. Steele?
Yeah, I certainly agree with restoring that funding. having been a single parent raising two girls on my own, boy, it was nice to have extracurricular activities like dance and theater and those types of things. And I believe that it's a good investment. I'm not real happy with the calculation Mr. Flynn did in terms of police and fire. That kind of stuck out at me. Public transportation is another one, but that's a whole other issue. I really am in favor of it, and I would be supporting it.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Mr. Flynn?
Just in wrap up, just so we're clear, okay, a 5.9% reduction in the supply budget is not a 5.9% reduction in a departmental budget. It is less than 0.5% in every single. We are leaving the departments, should the assembly in its wisdom choose to approve my amendments as written, we are leaving the department heads with a great deal of flexibility in how they manage a very, very small production.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. And I just want to make a comment in terms of your funding source. I appreciate the work that you've done, but I also know, like everybody else does, that the departments have really spent their budgets and already taken cuts. And everybody understands that, it's not supplies, it's wherever they want to find the money. But I think that they've done a really good job of finding savings. Thank you, Mr. Flynn. We're now at amendment number 11. It is offered by Mr. Evans and myself, and the department is the mayor, and it's $50,000, and it's to increase the mayor's community grants funding. It's the intent of this amendment that the Arts Advisory Commission grant be funded at the 2016 level of $137,500. Again, the amount is $50,000, and the funding source is fund balance. And I don't see any comments. We are now at amendment number 12, and this is Mr. Croft's amendment. And Mr. Croft's amendment is in the mayor's department again, and it's in the amount of $36,250 to increase the mayor's community grants funding. It's the intent of this amendment that the Arts Advisory Commission grant be funded at $123,750, a 10% reduction from 2016. That's the difference between Mr. Croft's proposed amendment and mine. The funding source is again fund balance. We are now at amendment number 13. Mr. Dunbar.
It's the same goal, just a smaller amount, $25,000 for the arts grant out of fund balance.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. We are now at amendment number 14. Mr. Weddleton.
This is $20,000 from the mayor's community grant to Glacier Valley Transit for operating costs. And the Girdwood area has their own little transit system that runs around from the resort all through town, and they get hundreds of thousands of dollars from the feds and other sources from LASRA. They expect a shortfall of about $20,000 this coming year. They're looking for that from Anchorage. And they do pitch in through their taxes towards public transit, so they're looking for a little bit of equity there. So the $20,000 really leverages a huge operation.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Mr. Flynn.
You don't have to answer now if you don't know the answer, but it'd be helpful to know what Girdwood property taxpayers are paying toward this service.
How much they do know, I don't have it.
Yeah, so
they did roughly estimate that.
If you can dig that up for consideration on Tuesday.
Thank you, Mr. Weddleton. Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Dunbar.
I have a question about this, Mr. Weldon, administration. So the $20,000 that's in the mayor's community grant, is it in some way dedicated to this, or is it another thing that they apply for every year and they kind of assume they're going to get? Or so I guess I don't quite understand how the mayor's community grant works in this particular context.
I did that choice from the Rose recommended that. Trust her judgment on that. It is the first time they've come. It's the first time they've come looking for money from the city for this.
Mr. Peterson and then Mr. Flynn.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so I actually hadn't heard of the Glacier Valley Transit group before. Do they run? Is that a year-round deal, just during tourist season or weekends or every day?
It's year-round. It's actually pretty remarkable. It's mostly funded by federal grants, and an interesting aspect is they had been charging, I think, $1.50 per ride, roughly. And they learned, the federal grant administrator said, well, why are you doing that? Because that decreases any dollar you get from fares decreases your federal grant. So now it's free, and they get the full federal grant.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Flynn, and then Mr. Dunbar.
Yeah, so a positive thing about this, the DUIs in Girdwood have dropped dramatically since this service has been implemented. So it's a good thing. The question Mr. Dunbar asked, I think, is particularly poignant, in which we actually don't get to direct where the community grants go through the budgetary process. We determine the level of grants that we authorize, similar to, as I was speaking of, the supply budgets, right? You know, got that line item I picked out to reduce. Ultimately, the department's going to budget to work within it. So we can say we would like to put $20,000 in the nearest community grants budget. We would like for it to go to the Glacier Valley Transit system, but ultimately that is up to the process that the mayor and the staff put in place.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Dunbar?
Yeah, so thank you for that, Mr. Flynn. And I realize this has a similar issue to my increase and several of ours increase to the arts portion of the community grants. But that does seem a little bit more diffuse to me. That is, many people will be applying for those grants. But this is very specific. And so I guess my question is to the administration. If we pass this amendment and Glacier Valley Transit comes with a legitimate, fully done application, will you dedicate these $20,000 from the mayor's community grants to Glacier Valley Transit?
We'll do what we're required to do, but if you require us to take $20,000 and give it to.
Well, I don't think we can require you, is sort of the point of the way it's structured.
We could, instead of doing it this way, we could send it to the Girdwood Board of Supervisors and say, this is how we want it used. And I suspect they would honor that request. The administration is not served under that level of subservience to the assembly action.
So maybe just asking nicely. If we can move money.
No, because it would come out of arts, it would come out of some of the other things that are required.
No, but
I think you have different ways, if you really want to do this, you have different vehicles to pursue this.
You could use public transit.
No pun intended.
I didn't say that.
You said vehicles.
I didn't say no pun intended.
So what
Thank you,
would those
Mr.
be?
Dunbar. Mr. Flynn? I have a comment, okay? Our budget analyst had it under public transit, but I didn't think that public transit had the ability to give a grant to the Girdwood Transit System, and so that's why I recommended this. But I'm sure there's a better way to do this so that it more clearly goes to Girdwood, and I think that we can talk about that offline and move forward.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, we are now at amendment number 15, Mr. Starr, but there's a substitute amendment that has been passed around.
And
Hopefully
Mr. Flynn, you're
everybody
actually
has
sitting
it.
on with you to make sure the administration gets it.
Oh,
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Starr.
This actually puts a number to an ongoing topic, and it's slightly controversial, but it needs to come out. And I'll pontificate a little bit in the amendment's not exactly worded right in the funding source, because I feel that we've had conversations that have just globally spoke to our fund balance. And if you backtrack, a good portion of our fund balance was a carry forward conversation from 2015. And we actually took out a assembly action and talked about property tax relief in the future, third quarter this or third quarter that. So we need to be cautious for a lot of different reasons, in my opinion, or my guidance. I've done this a few times, is that we're talking about funding sources just generally. And I think previous administrations have counseled us that the fund balance number that we're all appropriating out of isn't actually known yet. I mean, it's a number in flux. And so the anticipated fund balance is probably more correct nomenclature. If you want to say you're appropriating out of fund balance, I want to know basically what fund balance you're talking about. It's a known reserve, but that's also tied into a property tax amendment that we told some of the folks we would consider and other things. So are we having sort of a fund balance reserve account conversation, or are we appropriating 2017 funds out of anticipated fund balance, which grows or shrinks every day? Every day it doesn't snow, the fund balance goes up because we're basically not spending to our budgetary amount that we appropriated to roads and maintenance. So that's why fund balance changes from that, either overspending or underspending. In years past, as late as December, we've had the fire department come to us and say, we're $2 million short on our overtime budget. Those have been situations that have quickly diminished our ability to fund things that we anticipated in amendments because the fund balance eroded. I put this one out because it illustrates the fact that announced early on based on the calculations of today, and this conversation's got us in trouble. I'll flash back to the Mayor Begich years, had the very same conversation. What's the anticipated fund balance? Oh, we're in the positive numbers, everything's great. January 1 hit and we were $33 million in the hole based on fund balance conversations. I may paraphrase it a little bit, but I don't appreciate the conversation that sort of blends and dilutes the anticipated fund balance, the reserve fund balance for 2015, and then the fact that the fund balance number will change by the end of the year. So to say unequivocally we have $4.2 million available, maybe. I mean, that's what we went into back in January of this year because we brought almost $9 million forward, and we've, I'll use the word, frittered it away or appropriated through expanded spending throughout the year, as well as these other anticipated fund balance uses. However, that said, I want to make sure that we understand we have obligations due and thereof. And so this settlement, should it come down, needs to be funded. We have obligations that as well as the opportunity to divert, based on some of the mayor's negotiations and good faith by Klutman, to get out of a lawsuit that could cost us potentially a significant amount more, as well as get development back on track in the northern parts. I'm not going to go crazy on explaining why we should fund it. I think I'll leave that up to the administration to cooperatively work with us to say we do need to fund it. There's other ways to do it. We can raise taxes for a lawsuit. We can wipe out our fund balance. Let me just go lastly on this conversation. I have watched, and Mr. Flynn has watched, Mr. Train's watched, an ever-increasing, whether you agree with this statement or not, it's not what I put you on the spot for, but we've seen ever-increasing reliance on anticipated fund balance. And I'll tell you, as a budget hawk, or whatever you want to call me, I'm offended by the fact that we all of a sudden show up with $9 million of surplus money. Not offended in a bad way, that's good news. But the point is then we didn't do something right. We either had spending that could have been reduced earlier in the year, departments could have been more efficient, or whatever. But when you project kind of these larger surpluses, I look at them as we just didn't scrub the budget well enough. And we've had a stack up of continuous unbalance. Administrations would love to say, man, look at us, we came great. A lot of it's weather, a lot of it's the president come to town or not come to town. But the anticipation that you're always going to have a fund balance, I think you just need to be careful that you don't rely on the fact that that's how you're going to do your budgets when you have an S-version conversation. And the vast number of these are that. I want to make sure that we're talking about money that we move forward from 2015 to deal with later. So I would like to hold to the $5.75 million payment in this out-of-court via a vehicle that I believe we reserved money back in January or February when we moved from 2015 consciously. That's all.
Thank you, Mr. Stewart. Mr. Middleton?
So, Mr. Stewart, where's this dollar amount come from? Does this include like the water utilities expenses for the trunk lines? I mean, we had some vague.
Some of that, yeah, some of that. It's likely that that's the number that, it's likely that that's the number that Klutman will say gets them out of a lawsuit pursuit.
Thank you, Mr. Middleton. Mr. Flynn?
Well, I think Mr. Starr probably perhaps more eloquently expressed the reasons why I was seeking budget offsets as opposed to using fund balance for my
Exactly.
budget.
Wordy for sure. You're doing it with a little more support.
For this specific amendment, however, the tax cap is specifically structured to address legal settlements. And I would be, again, not to be argumentative, hesitant to use fund balance for this, given that I think the municipality would be better served by using fund balance to increase trust for long-term relief. If we have to take a one-term time hit, if the settlement doesn't pass, or judgment, or whatever it happens to be. I think from a financial management standpoint, I think that's a better choice. But I do appreciate, Mr. Starr, your advocacy for equipment. They're a good company, they're an important part of our community, and if we can come to an amicable settlement, I support it.
Still a work in progress.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Training.
Administration, what's your view on this amendment? Probably the first time you've seen it.
I think it's inappropriate for me to comment on something that's the subject of ongoing negotiation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Training. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Mr. Dunbar.
I guess what I was gonna say was similar to what Ethan just said. I think we all have sort of knowledge about this that was given to us in executive session. And I know, Mr. Starr, we had a long discussion about whether or not you'd be in that executive session. So, I'm wondering if we're even able, come the 15th, if we're even able to have kind of a fully informed public discussion about this without potentially violating what we have heard in the executive session. So I'm a little bit worried about this.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Falsey, would you like to give us some guidance?
Yeah, I think, Madam Chair, I think this one is a little bit tricky. That said, Subject Member Starr has brought information to the conversation that was not being from executive session, which he was fully capable of doing that. I will say that as we have been sitting down and trying to puzzle through the potential ways we might be able to resolve this implementation and also cash payments, fund balance is the operating notion of where those monies may come from. But conversations with the manager, there may be other options. If that in his lap, so he's come up with something, we'll see if that results in a different kind of recommendation. The final thought that probably should be realized earlier is that were the source of any potential settlement funds to come from fund balance, I'm not sure we'd actually even need an appropriation, as the settlement payments typically do not come from the municipal charities line item, just come from the 101 fund. So all that is to say, the conversation that is carried out so far has been appropriate, and start certainly free to bring whatever information we feel that we from other public sources.
And for the record, Madam Chair, Mr. Falsey and I spoke this morning. I think I still rely on Mr. Falsey as my lawyer of record on the conversation about what's going on. I may stretch those liberties, and sometimes you don't have to listen to our lawyer, but I made a call to Mr. Falsey on these conversations this morning, so my pledge is to not surprise anybody. But the idea of getting the conversation around a specific number is important for the fiscal health of the city.
Thank you, Mr. Starr. Thank you, Mr. Falsey. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And just, to throw this item out there, we have several amendments that are talking about the funding being from fund balance. And we have been receiving reports from the finance department saying that some of the projected income that the muni was projecting a year ago when we were doing our budget is coming in a little less than what we had anticipated. And so we are not 100% sure where we are going to be when with our fund balance come the end of December. So I think we might be spending money we don't have.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Starr.
And I, just say this because I learned it as well. And remember, there's two types of funding sources that are sort of backstopping the municipality. One is a prescribed number for emergency reserves that says we have to have a policy statement by this assembly that says we will keep so much money in the event of an earthquake or the event of major expenses that are unanticipated, as well as we have a fair amount of money that flexes from time to time in our money pool that backs up our bond rating. And so those are not to say that if we don't have the exact revenues that we need, we don't have a backup plan for that. My earlier statement was I'd rather not rely on the anticipation that we will. And you kind of said the same thing, as that changes and revenues change. But we do, and we are vested in a policy call that says we're going to keep, 2% and 10%, and it sometimes comes in as exact science, and sometimes it is. But we would want to preserve that, I would think, or raise it in some cases.
Thank you, Mr. Starr. I just have a comment in terms of fund balance, okay? Before this work session, well, in the beginning of this work session, I asked the administration what is the unrestricted fund balance right now, okay? And we were told that it's $4.5 million. So as far as I'm concerned, and this is the only way it could work, any of our proposed amendments that is using fund balance, it's referring to what is on the table right now today. It has nothing to do with the 14th month and next year and what the final things are. It's to do with what is on the table today. With that said, Mr. Steele?
Yeah, I'm concerned about, we just had a presentation on the SAP project, and I'm concerned about the need for money, and most of that will be coming in next year, and we're going to need some reserve, I suspect. And so anyway, I'm hesitant to draw down too much on that reserve in this process. I would rather that the administration and the city have the flexibility to fund things the way they want to fund it. Anyway.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. We are now at amendment number 16. Mr. Reynolds.
Well, 16 is $20,000 from the planning department towards an update of the Girdwood comprehensive plan. And that is, there's a lot of push from Girdwood to make changes to their land use code in Chapter 9 and Title 21, which typically should follow some kind of planning effort. And their comprehensive plan is decades old. So their expectation is that would have been done as soon as the land use plan is done, which we shall be finishing fairly soon. But it turns out there's no money in the budget for the Girdwood plan. So this is a small amount of seed money. I've heard from the planning director, his idea is to get creative ways to fund it. So I want to make sure there's a little bit of money to at least jumpstart that creative process and try to get a plan done before we start tackling big changes in their land use code.
Thank you, Mr. Weatherton. Mr. Traynor?
I like the price that we pay for the Mountain View plan. Zero.
Yeah, Chair.
We can't all be that good.
Thank you, Mr.
I know we
Traynor.
could talk to them.
Thank you, Mr. Traynor. Mr. Flynn, Mr. Starr?
No, and that's a fair observation. There are creative ways. We wrote our Chapter 10, our basically our land use code modified one of our parks departments. I mean, we tax ourselves for those kind of purposes, and so Girdwood has a service area designation and can certainly take control of the product. Mountain View did it, and Chugat Eagle River's done it multiple times on that, so I wouldn't be so quick to feel like it's the city's responsibility to plan Girdwood always. I mean, I feel some of that, but independent nature of Chugat Eagle River has gotten, I believe, a better product when they own it.
Thank you, Mr. Starr. Mr. Flynn?
Yeah, I think Mr. Starr raises a good point, as did Mr. Traynor. I will say, however, there's basically one major landowner in Girdwood. He's somebody with whom I have a business relationship. And he's the guy who pays the bill when we say Girdwood fund. So it's a little bit excessive. You pay a significant portion of the bill. And I guess if there were a more balanced land ownership scenario, I would be quick to agree with you, because if not, I'm a little hesitant.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. We are now at amendment number 17. Mr. Flynn?
Doesn't only that much, right? Again, those who are newer to the body may not know, but those who've been around for a while know I've been a pretty vigorous supporter of public transit. I was particularly disturbed by the decision to reduce route service on holidays, given that many of us use those holidays to do our holiday shopping, keep dollars in our community as opposed to online. And people who work in retail outlets often rely on public transit to get to work and home on those days. And I thought it was important to continue my advocacy for public transit, and that's why this amendment is in place. Again, fund source is a very small reduction to the supply budget.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Starr?
to the administration, specifically Mr. Wilbur, you wear two hats here, which is kind of nice, because you have a lot of knowledge in that conversation. Personally, I would appreciate you not weighing in right now, but giving us sort of that summary, and we've reached compromises before in this very conversation, is that personally, I could take the hit that 102 doesn't expand on the holidays, which is the TVIP river route structure, partly because it doesn't stop at Tehopney when the shopping malls of the world. So is there a compromise here in ridership numbers that aren't going to see an increase in transportation? Business corridors closed, but maybe give us your best in a white paper summary as to what you think is necessary. You guys are proposing a reduction in that. The administration is, you're part of that?
Right. So the proposal here is to reduce the holidays, as Mr. Flynn suggested. The proposal is 7 holidays, and the total amount is $320,000. And so when we asked public transportation for a proposed reduction, we gave them a target, and then based on that target, this was their proposal. There's, as you suggest, there's different ways you could do that. This way here, it's actually the effect is it's on every single network on one day, so it affects everybody equally on those days, and that may be why we will propose it this way. But there's other solutions, and we can talk to we'll find a different solution with the same number.
Well, it isn't a tremendous amount of work to get your input in there too. I value that because you've seen that. We've tried to do it before, just a blatant cut, and I think surgically there would be a better way. My example of Eagle River, we don't particularly need to. Holidays are different than Veterans Day. So our Christmas holidays are different than Veterans Day. So, and the ridership is important as well. So, I mean, if we're restoring and only 3 people are going to ride the route, I would question if that is a big bang.
Yeah, the service, the ridership, and the revenue. You want to look at all 3 of those things to find out where your most efficient is. And so when you're looking at those things, holidays.
Well, if you can engage the conversation from the previous manager, I would like that.
Yep.
Thank you, Mr. Wilbur. Thank you, Mr. Starr. Let the record reflect that Mr. Evans has joined us. Mr. Peterson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to refresh my memory, the holidays you were talking about wasn't one of those Black Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, buses were curtailed. I thought when I saw that was counterintuitive to me, because that's one of the busiest days of the year, and you would think that employees would need to get to the shopping centers to do their work, and shoppers may not be able to find parking, so they may decide to take public transportation that day. Just from what I remember, I thought it was the day after Thanksgiving. It was also
It was one of the holidays. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Flynn.
Yeah, Mr. Starr makes a very good comment. Maybe we don't need the whole 320 back if there's some routes that we can curtail without significantly impacting the ridership. But this is important to me, and I think it's important to our community. So something needs to go back in. I will talk to the transit director.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Starr.
I just didn't know if you were going to wrap up this last amendment.
As soon as the comments are done.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any other questions. Amendment number 17, Mr. Trainer. I'm sorry, amendment number 18, Mr. Trainer.
This was George funding for the bus, but he uses fund balance. Rather shot in the miscellaneous department now.
What? I'm trying to keep the budget down.
Try to keep them out of amendments.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Trainer. Mr. Evans.
Thanks, Madam Chair. I don't know why this meeting didn't start at 1 o'clock like I had it on my calendar, but
Who are you again?
so if you could start over again. I meant to, and I notified the clerk earlier, I'm not, whatever amendments went through their mind, I'm not going to be introducing or doing anything in light of all the amendments I've seen. And just quickly, on Mr. Flynn's amendments, the reductions in the supply budget, do we have any idea, or do you have any idea of what that actual, I know the amounts, but I know the amounts by department, I just don't know what that means.
So the aggregate per department is about 5.9%. The aggregate by departmental budget is generally under 0.5%.
pull. Do we know what that means? I mean, if $72,000 from the police budget, what does that actually mean that they?
It means we give them a line item, and I apologize that you missed this conversation. We give them a line item for their departmental budget. They
Right.
manage it. So we're talking less than a 0.5% reduction by department to manage for 2017.
Thank you, Mr. Evans, Mr. Flynn, Mr. Steele.
Do they have the ability to transfer within line items?
Absolutely. We give them
That's what I
a
thought.
departmental line item.
Yeah.
Great, thank you, Mr. Steele, Mr. Flynn. We're at the last amendment, and it's on the capital budget, and it's the only amendment on the capital budget, Mr. Dunbar.
This is co-sponsored by myself and Mr. Peterson. Pete, do you want to speak to this? You want me to?
Again,
So he might want to add more to this, but the Pleasant Valley subdivision, for those of you who may have been through it, it's just off of the Tudor Curve, south of the Totem Theater, and it's has among the worst roads in our district. Keith and I have both walked them many times, many frost heaves. It needs basically a total reconstruction, which is going to be one of these large projects over the course of the next 5 to 10 years. But Pete and I want to get that process started. We know there's some leftover money, and the administration tells about $400,000 from a previous, I believe it's a state grant that they still have. And we've been speaking with the administration about this, and we want to shift funds there to start doing preliminary planning. It's a large area, so we think it can be done in phases, maybe 2 or 3 phases, so some of it will be rebuilt and some of it won't. And this particular amendment is revenue neutral. We are taking the money from another project in our district, the Tudor Center Diplomacy Drive resurfacing. Haven't been out there. It's that particular drive is, I'm sure it could use a resurfacing at some point, but it doesn't appear to be in such a dire circumstance that we need to do it immediately. So we felt this was a higher priority.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Flynn?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. Again, I don't need an answer today, but it would be helpful to have an idea of rough order of magnitude, the overall cost of this project.
$15 million.
And whether or not there is a reasonable opportunity to create it's not a LRSA, it's a
Road improvement.
Road improvement, a RID, yeah, it's like a road improvement to address this. Not that we want to put more excess burden on any given group of homeowners, but similarly, we don't want to necessarily burden the entire community for a specific neighborhood. So some feel for what that might look like would be helpful to at least contemplate prior to voting.
Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Steele?
Yeah, I wonder if the condition of the infrastructure, the rest of the infrastructure that's in that ground out there has been looked at.
Pipes.
Yeah, I mean, the roads are bad, but that's a low-lying wet area. And the question is, you do the roads, and
What comes next?
you're gonna be tearing them up next week. So I don't know, I think a holistic approach would take to it.
Thank you, Mr. Steele. Mr. Peterson?
thank you, Madam Chair, and I've spoken with Jerry Hansen about this area several times. He's aware, as soon as I started talking about it, he knew exactly what I was talking about. And he knew it was gonna be a big project, and they figured that they were gonna have to break it into 3 segments so that they'd be able to fix a segment, but people will still be able to drive to their homes. There's simply a way for them to get to the driveway. And I actually had a constituent call me last spring saying that the road was in such bad shape, he wasn't even gonna let his daughter ride her bicycle on it because it was too dangerous. So, and the frosties would, I mean, it was like a natural speed hump, you know? Originally,
There's
instead of
more.
going across the road this way, it was going diagonally across the road, which really is rather strange.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Mr. Bosky, do you have any comments or questions?
No, not right now, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. There are no other amendments in this meeting. This
I
kind of-
had
I'm sorry,
a
Mr. Starr?
question, and just maybe process that you can think about from that is that typically when we have a member out of town or calling in, which is gonna be me on Tuesday, it requires a voice vote or thereabouts. I'm trying to avoid the voice vote opportunity for you, so if there would be a way that electronically I could vote, I'd be happy to do that. But, and I don't know how you wanna handle that, but when complicating meetings occur and you can't use the board every time, so I'm just looking to see how you wanna handle that. It's frustrating. It's frustrating for me too, because I gotta go between mute and not mute, you know, jump around and.
Well, Madam Chair, if I may.
As soon as Mr. Delbar speaks, when you can, he was next. Thank you, Mr. Delbar.
Sorry, Madam Chair, I just wanted to make sure that we weren't about to close the meeting because we said we were going to address the administration's changes.
As a matter of fact, since Mr. Evans was, had the wrong time, we're gonna start from the beginning. Thank you, Mr. Flynn. Mr. Flynn.
Yeah, Madam Chair, I think you've done this before as chair, as has Mr. Crane. I think I have too. I think it's appropriate, given Mr. Starr's comment, to allow him to vote first and then have the clerk record that vote and the rest of us vote on the floor. Worked pretty smoothly when we used it in the past, and I think it's a good solution to, rather than having to do voice votes in every single way. So I leave it to your wisdom, Madam.
We're gonna handle this. Mr. Training?
I think we can. We've done that before. He would be the first to vote. And Bill, as something to help you with, give me your proxy vote. I'll vote for you.
We'll handle it.
Sorry.
And before we close the work session, I do want to hear from the administration in terms of when we can expect to receive the substitute version.
So I think Monday.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so
I mean, we'll work on it today, but it's just Monday.
Monday.
What time?
As soon as
It's 11 a.m.
As not as possible.
As
We will
soon as
shoot for the morning. We will shoot
And
for
that
the
will be
morning.
really, really great.
Yeah,
So
we wanna give you
we'll
time
know
to
what's
consume
what,
it.
and then we'll have an opportunity to prepare our proposed amendments that were not included in the substitute version. I think Mr. Dunbar didn't use the training.
So on the fire budget for the administration, so these additional cuts, and I believe there were some cuts to certain portions of it in the original budget you proposed.
Right.
Are we contemplating any kind of rolling closures? Is that something that we have discussed with the fire department? Is it something that is likely? Chief LeBlanc, you can speak to that too.
So also,
Rolling closures could potentially be an option. Just heard right now a supply cut to the fire department, that would be $300,000. I don't know where the $150,000 comes from, but any type of closure would be absolutely the last thing that we would consider. But as we consider things, everything is on the table.
Thank you, Mr. Dunbar. Mr. Training and Mr. Starr.
No, I don't need to.
Lance, could you try before noon, sir? Because we'd like to be able to digest what the administration gives us, so we're ready to vote on it Tuesday. I know it's pretty incredible.
we're going to, as fast as we can, we want to give you as much time as possible, so. I have, again, we'll have to get together as administration to consume what your proposals are and whether or not we can, how much and.
We don't have to be
do it.
interested.
That's gonna take some time.
We don't have to approve the budget on Tuesday. What's the drop dead date on that?
I think it's December 10th.
But Lance, I'd really appreciate your comments on all the amendments.
Yeah.
Yea or nay with administration's point of view on it. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Training. Mr. Flynn?
No, just
Oh, I thought-
the reason
Okay,
I
great.
put
You
mine
don't have
out
to
early was
sit.
to make sure there was plenty of time for everyone to digest them.
Thank you. Mr. Riddleton?
So I had a question on, you've got line 7, CFO office labor adjustment. You kind of allocate 60,000 to this 191 fund.
Right.
So what are these other increases in the 191? Just the 306?
So there's, those are for staffing and labor, so basically staff, that one of them would be for a position that we would charge to the 191 fund. And then they have a request for additional professional services and supplies that weren't in the budget. And so in order to accommodate those additions, we would then cover them rather than the property taxes, we would use that fund. That's the request.
Okay, so it's not money transferred like you did with fire.
Thank Okay, Mr. Middleton, Mr. Evans?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And to Lance, and if I missed this before, I apologize, but the additional fuel savings, the 192.4, I know there was a bunch of fuel savings already built in the regular budget. Where did this additional amount come from?
So, we're looking at, as Madam Chair alluded to earlier, the things in flux. So we do a projection on how much fuel costs, what we're paying, and what we're using. And so there's probably a little bit of softness in the fuel budget. Honestly, we're gonna be looking at that to look to another opportunity, but we're trying to get to a zero. We're not projecting to use any fund balance, so we're trying to find out where the pluses and minuses are, and without a reduction in service or professional services contract, which still might be an opportunity that we look at. But without that, my goal to you was to get to a zero, and the only place I think that we might have a little bit of room is in fuel. We reduced it by $1 million. This would be another 10%. And honestly, the fuel prices are still favorable for us, so that's what we're looking at. That's why we chose that one.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Mr. Dunbar?
Last question on the, and this might be actually more you, Madam Chair, or to the clerk. So on line 2, we have an additional $150,000 for space rental for vote by mail. So I know we'd already appropriated $1 million. My understanding was that we were going to rent a space using a portion of that funds. Is that no longer the case? Why do we need an additional $150,000, especially considering that we're not actually going to do a vote by mail?
Mr. Peterson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's looking like the price we're going to be paying for some of the machinery is a little higher than we had budgeted. And so it looks like we're going to be over top of that $1 million projection. So that might be why this is looking at it.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Let the record reflect that Mr. Croft has joined us, and I'm assuming that he probably didn't realize the meeting was changed to 12.
I thought it was 30 for 1, yes ma'am.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, Mr. Croft.
That's what lawyers need to get the new updated system.
Any other comments or questions from anybody before we adjourn this work session? Doesn't look like it. Work session adjourned. Thank you.